Just days after President Biden pardoned his son, Politico is now reporting that his team is also discussing preemptive pardons for prominent figures of the MAGA enemies list, including Dr. Anthony Fauci, Senator-elect Adam Schiff, and also Liz Cheney, who, of course, endorsed Kamala Harris and led the January 6th investigation on Capitol Hill. Is this a good idea?
So yesterday it was announced that Joe Biden might be preemptively pardoning individuals after he just pardoned his son, Hunter Biden. Now, I know a lot of you guys don't care too much about the US politics, but as you heard from the opening, one of those individuals is Dr. Anthony Fauci. And as a Canadian, that really pisses me off because I see him as numero uno on the list of people responsible for the pandemic, for COVID, and putting us all through that. Now, most of you could probably figure out why I would put him at the top of the list. He was one of the directors for the NIH, or the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He was constantly on the TV, flip-flopping between promoting social distancing, then saying social distancing didn't even work. They weren't even sure of the numbers. They were just kind of guessing.
But we talked about the 6-foot distance an awful lot today. Do you recall if it was ever suggested to be 10 feet?
You know, I don't recall, Mitch, if it was ever suggested it was 10 feet, but when I made my explanation of what it was, I was saying that there was no trial that looked at 10 versus 6 versus 3 versus not even worrying about it at all.
And you said today that there were discussions at the White House about the 6-foot rule. You don't recall if it was discussions about whether or not it should be 3 or should be 10 or should be 6?
You know, I don't recall, Mitch, what the exact discussion was. But as I've said in response to multiple questions, what we had, the CDC was said that on the basis of their evaluation, which was based on the droplet approach, that 6 foot would be to go. And since there was no clinical trials going one way or the other, that's why it was accepted by the group.
This was also the same case for the mask situation, where he would first say that you didn't need to wear a mask, then he was saying you really needed to wear a mask. Then he came out saying, well, on a broad scale, the mask actually didn't do anything, but for individuals, that's when the masks were important.
People should not be walking around with masks.
You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet. But it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is. And often there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask and they keep touching their face.
And can you get some schmutz sort of staying inside there?
Of course. But when you think masks, you should think of healthcare providers needing them and people who are ill.
Would I repeat maybe 20, 30 times a day that in order to avoid the acquisition and transmission of this virus, which is highly transmissible, you should have uniform wearing of masks. You should have physical distancing.
Most rigorous and comprehensive analysis of scientific studies conducted on the efficacy of masks for reducing the spread of respiratory illness, including COVID-19, was published last month. Its conclusions, said Tom Jefferson, the Oxford epidemiologist who is the lead author, were unambiguous. There is just no evidence that masks, make any difference, he told the journalist Mayan Damasi, full stop. But wait, hold on. What about the N95 masks as opposed to the lower quality surgical or cloth masks? Makes no difference. None of it, he said. Well, what about the studies that initially persuaded policymakers to impose mask mandates? They were convinced by non-randomized studies, flawed observational studies. How do we get beyond that finding of that particular review?
Yeah, but there are other studies, Michael, that show at an individual level for individual. When you're talking about the effect on the epidemic or the pandemic as a whole, the data are less strong. But when you talk about as an individual basis of someone protecting themselves or protecting themselves from spreading it to others, there's no doubt that there are many studies that show that there is an advantage. When you took at the broad population level, like the Cochrane study, the data are less firm with regard to the effect on the overall pandemic.
But the main problem I have with this announcement about the preemptive pardoning is that when he was at Congress, he was questioned multiple times about gain-of-function research, if the NIH funded it. He lied saying it didn't. They came back, said, actually, no, we have documentation from other directors saying you did fund gain-of-function research. And the purpose of gain-of-function research is that you take a viral organism and you mutate it to be even stronger, which is exactly what happened. But the real kicker is the amount of times this guy said that this wasn't done in a lab, it was from nature, even though we know that's not true today, and almost all of the evidence prior to today led to the lab, and he kept trying to say it wasn't.
You have said that I am unwilling to take any responsibility for the current pandemic. I have no responsibility for the current pandemic. The current pandemic, okay? Number two, you said the overwhelming amount of evidence indicates that's a lab leak. I believe most card-carrying viral phylogenists and molecular virologists would disagree with you that is much more likely, even though we leave open all possibilities, it's much more likely that this was a natural occurrence.
If it may have been a lab, may have been nature, we're supposed to look forward, then why did Dr. Fauci work so hard for just one of those theories?
What do you say to that? I'm almost have to laugh at that, Neil. I mean, that's totally bizarre. First of all, I wasn't leaning totally strongly one way or the other. Flashback. What I do feel strongly about is that this was a spillover from an animal species to a human.
Strongly suggesting that, in fact, it was a natural occurrence.
Very strongly. Strongly indicating that it was a natural spillover.
Strongly points to this being a natural occurrence.
Pointing much more strongly towards a natural occurrence. Very, very strongly. Strongly favors a natural occurrence. I wasn't leaning totally strongly one way or the other.
Is very, very strongly leaning towards this could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated.
Now, again, I'm not saying he's solely responsible for the pandemic, but the response to the pandemic, I hold mainstream media, people like Rachel Maddow, who kept promoting, get the vaccine, you won't be able to transfer it. Even Anthony Fauci himself, you can track the timelines of his story changing drastically.
You might have virus in your nasopharynx, and even though you really feel well, you could inadvertently pass it on to someone else.
It is very unlikely that a vaccinated person, even if there's a breakthrough infection, would transmit it to someone else.
If you're vaccinated, you really don't need to worry about getting it in a way that's serious or transmitting it.
You nailed it, Chris. That's correct. Okay. That's absolutely correct. You're absolutely right. You said it correctly. The risk is extremely low of getting infected, of getting sick, or of transmitting it to anybody else. You should care, because if you get infected and you're not vaccinated, there is a chance, maybe a likelihood, that you will be part of the dynamics of the continuation of the chain of transmission. Namely, you will inadvertently or innocently transmit it to someone else, who will then transmit it to someone else. And I don't think anyone would intentionally want to be part of the transmission chain. You want to be a dead end to the virus. So when the virus gets to you, you stop it. You don't allow it to use you as the stepping stone to the next person. Vaccinated people are clearly capable of transmitting the infection to an uninfected person.
So now to have this information that he might be preemptively pardoned, meaning he won't have to serve any jail time, he won't have any criminality put against him, even when Congress and the senators found that he lied under oath, he should be criminally charged. Now it looks like he's potentially going to be scot-free of it, which is a huge slap in the face to everyone that suffered through the pandemic, lost their job through the pandemic, wasn't allowed to work. And top of mind to me is a lot of the truckers, the trucker convoy. This is absolutely ridiculous. And again, these are just reports. I don't think anything is actually set in stone. But the fact that Biden, has backtracked on his word of not pardoning his son, and then he pardoned his son, now that this report is out, it's looking like that's how it's going to go. But anyways, I'll try to keep you guys up to date if you do care about this. If not, I'll see you guys on the next video. Thanks so much.